And we need to make sure that we're not getting sucked into this social justice, social gospel, overly woke sort of Christianity where we're too busy posting blacked out squares that we forget what we're supposed to be doing. We need to be reaching people. We need to be loving people. Everyone, welcome to this episode of the Contend podcast. We have something a little bit different that we're talking about today, a little bit more somber. It's not a contender through history. It's not something that is our normal sort of things on the Contend podcast, but obviously it's a current event, so it's something that needs to be addressed. And I know my voice is somewhat small with my Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, things of that nature. My voice isn't nearly as large as others. But I do think it's important for people in the faith community, in churches and things of that nature, to have a position on current events as well as state that position. So I just want to address a couple things that are going on. Obviously, a little over a week ago, a week and a half ago now, a man by the name of George Floyd was murdered by a Minneapolis police department officer. And I just want to go on record and start by saying that was wrong. Obviously, everyone I know, there's a few crazies, obviously, that you will see on Facebook or something, but everyone thought that was a terrible thing. Everyone thought that was horrendous. We saw people, multiple camera angles, multiple people saying that he couldn't breathe, that he was being killed. Even after he went, his body went limp, and he had been struggling. You could hear him getting weaker, and after he went limp, the police officer still kept his knee on his neck. And you all, I'm sure, have either seen the video or know the story at least. So I don't need to go into that. Don't need to show the video or anything like that. But that was wrong. That was something that was not right. And let me just also say that racism has always been wrong. Racism is wrong. The founding of this country, I know that we had slavery, and if you go back even farther than that, slavery was not originally white guys owning or I guess they weren't African Americans, but white guys owning African slaves. It goes back even farther than that into Europe, where it was white people owning white people. But slavery has always been wrong. Racism has always been wrong. I've always held that view. I don't like racism. I hate racism. I think it's a terrible thing. But we've come to a point in our country and our society where just saying I've never been a racist isn't enough. You have to now be changing your stance into a more woke sort of everything, you know, and you know what I mean by that. You have to be more on the activism side of whether it be the Black Lives Matter movement, which, and let me just also say, Black lives do matter. All lives matter. The Lord made it very clear that it says God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Christ died for everyone. Every life matters. And too many times I think people will use the all lives matter as a response to someone when they say Black lives matter, and so there's that clash. But when I say all lives matter, I think, of course, Black lives matter, because all lives matter. So I do think that is something that we need to kind of bridge that gap. It can't be Black lives matter people and all lives matter people. It just needs to be everyone is important. The Lord loves everyone. It is our job as the church to reach everyone. And that's really the idea of this podcast. I hope that you've listened far enough, you got past those first 3.5 minutes, that you can get to really the meat of what I'm trying to get at. The murder of George Floyd was wrong. I said that from the very beginning. I said, man, that cop was way out of line. And I didn't even look at it initially as a race thing, and I still truly don't. But racism is wrong. But just on that same token, so is looting, so is stealing, so is killing other people because someone got killed. Those things are all wrong also. But that should mobilize us as the church. We need to realize, hey, it is our time. We need to get busy. We need to be praying for the country. We need to be praying for the lost. We need to be doing everything we can to see as many people come to Christ as we can during this time. We need to love like Jesus loved, and we need to be the church like Jesus was, or be the church as Jesus commanded us to be. And we need to make sure that we're not getting sucked into this social justice, social gospel, overly woke sort of Christianity where we're too busy posting blacked out squares that we forget what we're supposed to be doing. We need to be reaching people. We need to be loving people. So the idea for this whole podcast, it's hey, the murder of George Floyd was wrong. That was a terrible thing. Racism is a terrible thing. Looting, stealing, all those things that have been birthed from what happened, those are all terrible things. But we as the church, we need to not get caught up with that. We need to not get caught up with all the bad that's going on. We need to realize, hey, all those people need love. They all need Jesus. All the politicians and everyone, they all have the same need. They need Jesus, and that's our job. We need to get them the gospel while we still can. So we need to love like Jesus loved. Be the church. Don't get sucked into this social justice, social gospel. And we need to love like Jesus loved and be the church that Jesus has called us to be. So you might be thinking, give me an example. How does Jesus love even someone who might not be the same ethnicity, the same race, or whatever? I'm going to give you a couple scriptures and run through them really quickly. But they'll be linked in the description so you can look them up and study them out a little bit. The first one we see is in Luke chapter 17, in verse number 11. It says, "And it came to pass as he went to Jerusalem," this is Jesus, "that he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee." We know the division between the Jews and the Samaritans. The Samaritans, they were looked down upon by the Jews, and thus the Jews by the Samaritans, and we find that they didn't like each other. But it says, as he entered into a certain village, there met him 10 men that were lepers, which stood afar off. And we know this story, how that these lepers were afar off, and they call out to him, and he heals them. Now he could have said, well, you guys are Samaritans. You guys are not from Samaria. You're not from Jerusalem. You're from Samaria. You're from Galilee. But what does he do? He heals them, and we see that play out. Just like I believe it should. It doesn't matter where someone's from. It doesn't matter the division that we normally have between these two things. But when we live like Jesus, it should compel us to help other people. Another one, John chapter 4. In verse number 4 down through verse 26, I'm not going to read all of them, but it says, "And he must needs go through Samaria." I think that's a very interesting thing. We read this and then we find out it's because he needs to help one woman, who in turn helps the entire village. But it says he must needs go through Samaria, then come to the city, to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And this is where he meets the Samaritan woman at the well. What does he do? He sits there and waits for her, and she comes, and then he tells her of sin, and she ends up leaving full of living water, and goes and tells the whole city, and they turn to Christ because of it. Now, just imagine if we were to have that same kind of love for those who maybe don't look like us, maybe who don't see eye to eye with us. We could change a whole city, perhaps, because we influence one person. Last one, very familiar story, Luke chapter 10. It starts in verse number 25, really, but we're going to jump down to verse number 30. It says, "And Jesus answering said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him." We see that he also cared for him. We see that he paid for him to be renewed and be healed. What a wonderful picture that is for our country. What we need now is some Samaritans, some good Samaritans. We need people who are willing to just reach out and say, hey, I know things are tough. I know things are wrong, but I know someone. I have a direct relationship with someone that can help you. I have a relationship, and I believe in Christ, and I want to help you. So those are just a couple things, something very important. Like I said, I'll link those scriptures down below. I encourage you to study those out and see where racism could have prevailed in the Bible, but it didn't. So we need to love like Jesus. We need to be the church that God has called us to be, and we need to do everything we can while we still have time to influence people for Christ and to love like Jesus would love. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Contend podcast. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments. I know it was a little different than normal, but if you're not already subscribed, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you thought in the comments. As I said, maybe share this with your friends. And remember, don't be a pretender, be a contender.